Those in charge, Churchill and his commanders-in-chief and his war cabinet, knew that, in fact, the Germans intended to fight every inch of the way.
The history books say World War II ended in 1945, but for some, that war didn't end in Berlin. It ended 7,000 miles away under the Atlantic Ocean. In 2023, a research drone off the coast of Argentina found a massive object that simply shouldn't exist. A ghost ship packed with cargo that would change history as we know it. We thought the story of World War II was over, but the rusty hull of the ship tells a very different, darker story. The Ghost Ship Paradox. March 14th, 2023. A drone descends into the pitch-black, freezing water. In viral footage released by Reef Discovery, the research vessel Atlantis Explorer was scanning the ocean floor just 40 nautical miles off the coast of Mar del Plata, looking for geological anomalies. Instead, they found lost treasure 300 feet down. Emerging from the depths, like a ghost from another era, was the wreckage of a massive cargo ship. As the drone's spotlight cut through the murk, it lit up barely visible Gothic text on the bow that read SS Mark.
And below me is the Markgraf. The Markgraf is a German First World War König-class dreadnought battleship.
This sent a chill through the research team because historically, the SS Mark, or Markgraf, was reported as lost in the North Atlantic in April 1945, along with all its crew members. It was supposed to be at the bottom of the ocean near Iceland. So what on earth was it doing 7,000 miles off course, hiding in the waters of Argentina? But the mystery of its location paled in comparison to what was inside. As the drone found its way around the disintegrating cargo hold, the camera captured rows of heavy metal containers stacked against the rotting bulkheads, barely held back by decaying moth-eaten rope netting. Some had burst open, and there, glittering in the decay, was gold. Hundreds of bars. A survey team later estimated there to be over 400 bars, valued today at above $300 million. But this wasn't pirate treasure or commercial bullion. This was what historians call tainted gold. You see, when the Nazi regime began to collapse, they melted down everything they had stolen from their victims, from heirlooms to wedding rings ripped from fingers and even dental gold. This shipwreck was carrying the melted-down remains of thousands of Holocaust victims, the perfect metaphor for the regime itself. Wealth built on death. But this story is a bit strange, because if you look for the SS Mark in the German naval archives, you won't find it. When historians tried to verify the Reef Discovery claims, they had a hard time, as the only Markgraf in German naval history was a World War I battleship that was scuttled in Scapa Flow, Scotland, in 1919. It's still there today, a popular diving site. There is no record of a World War II cargo ship named the Mark or Markgraf ever existing, let alone fleeing to Argentina. So we are left with a terrifying paradox. We have a viral video showing a ship that physically exists but has no records, carrying gold that shouldn't be there. Is it a hoax? Or was the SS Mark an actual ghost ship, a vessel erased from history before it ever set sail? To understand why a government would erase a ship from history, you have to understand the mission it was supposedly built for. A mission so secret, the crew likely knew they were dead men the moment they stepped aboard. It was a final, desperate gamble called Operation Valkyrie Gold. By April 7, 1945, the 1,000-year Reich was crumbling into dust. The Red Army was tearing through the outskirts of Berlin, and the streets were filled with terrified teenagers and old men forced to hold the line. But while the city burned, the elite weren't fighting, they were packing. According to recovered intelligence files, the SS Mark wasn't just a cargo ship. It was a lifeboat for the Nazis, who knew they had lost and weren't planning to go down easily. They departed from a quiet, mist-shrouded port in Norway under the cover of darkness with a simple goal: get the money and the men to South America before the Allies could get to them. In 1945, Allied intelligence estimated that the Nazis successfully hid over $500 million in assets globally. That's $7 billion in today's money. But back in the depths of the Atlantic, the Atlantis Explorer drone found something far more valuable than the bullion. The drone operator piloted the drone toward the captain's quarters and found a series of heavy waterproof canisters used for top-secret naval transport. The drone's manipulator arm brushed away the decades of sediment, revealing contents that would turn this discovery into an international incident. According to the reef discovery narrative, the drone didn't just find gold bars, it found the insurance policy of the Third Reich. Tucked away in the captain's personal safe, preserved in military-grade waterproof cylinders, were documents that historians have spent 80 years praying didn't exist. Inside were logs and passenger manifests. And after analyzing the names on those lists, they were found to be the names of high-ranking SS officers, scientists, and architects of the Holocaust who were officially listed as dead in Berlin. But they didn't die in Berlin. They died here, en route to a new life. But it gets darker. The drone also captured images of photographs preserved in the watertight seals, grainy black and white evidence showing these same Nazi officials shaking hands with men in Allied uniforms. It changes everything we thought we knew about the end of the war. This wasn't just an escape, it was leverage. You see, gold buys a new life, but blackmail documents buy safety. It suggests that someone on the winning side let them go. Ask yourself, why would the Argentine Navy immediately seal the site in 2023 if they had nothing to hide? After all, who would want to admit that their grandfathers welcomed monsters with open arms? The internet is currently tearing itself apart, fighting over this ghost ship. Forums are exploding with theories about the SS mark and unlocking the Fourth Reich. But while everyone is looking at drone footage of a ship that might be fake, they are ignoring the terrifying truth that is staring them right in the face. We have the logs of the real ships that arrived in South America, and they didn't arrive in secret. But let's forget 2023 for a bit and rewind the clock back to July 10, 1945. The war had ended and the world was celebrating, but somewhere off the coast of Mar del Plata, a periscope breached the water's surface. The real wolves of the Atlantic. In the chaotic weeks following the fall of Berlin, Allied intelligence was in a state of absolute panic. They had done the math and counted the surrendered submarines in European ports, and the numbers didn't match. Dozens of U-boats were unaccounted for. They seemed to have vanished into the Grey Wolf abyss. They called it the Ghost Convoy. The U.S. Navy was terrified that these missing wolves were gathering for a final last stand, or worse, that they were transporting the leaders of the Third Reich to a secret sanctuary. The ocean is a big place, and a U-boat is designed to be invisible. The war was over on paper, but at sea the silence was unsettling. But the Ghost Convoy didn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, hunger and fuel shortages forced them to rise. And the first one to break the silence was a 76-meter-long steel shark that brought the war right to South America's doorstep. It was called U-530. On the morning of July 10, 1945, the locals of Mar del Plata were shivering in the damp Argentine winter, going about their post-war lives. The radio had told them the Third Reich was dead. But then, cutting through the heavy mist like a phantom, a gray silhouette breached the surface of the naval base. It wasn't a fishing boat, it was a Type 9C/40 U-boat, and it was flying the German ensign.
On the 10th of July 1945, the German U-boat U-530 appeared quite unexpectedly off the Argentinian port of Mar del Plata and surrendered.
When the hatch finally creaked open, the first thing that hit the Argentine sailors wasn't a greeting, but the smell. A suffocating, toxic cocktail of diesel fumes, rotting food, and the stale sweat of dozens of men who hadn't seen the sun or a shower in months. It was the scent of desperation, but the man who climbed out of that hatch didn't look desperate. Oberleutnant Otto Vermuth, a young, arrogant, and seemingly unrepentant 25-year-old, stood on the conning tower of his iron coffin, staring down at the stunned Argentine officials. He didn't look like a man surrendering. He looked like a man who had completed a mission.
In January 1945, her new commanding officer was Oberleutnant Otto Vermuth. Of his mission, Wehrmacht said he operated directly on orders from Berlin.
And that detail kept Allied intelligence officers awake at night. The war ended in May. Wehrmacht could have raised the white flag in Norway. He could have surrendered in Scotland. Instead, he kept his crew in a metal tube for 2 extra months, dodging Allied patrols and navigating treacherous waters to travel 6,000 miles to the bottom of the world. Why travel 6,000 miles through enemy waters unless they were carrying something or someone precious? The panic was instant, and it went all the way to the top, with one core message behind it. Hitler is alive. The USA was terrified that Wehrmacht had dropped the Führer off on a remote beach before docking. They tore the ship apart looking for evidence and found nothing. Wehrmacht just smiled and said nothing. Just when the panic surrounding U-530 began to settle, the ocean delivered a second, even more terrifying shock. On August 17, 1945, more than 3 months after Germany had officially surrendered, another U-boat broke the surface at Mar del Plata. This was the U-977. And if the crew of the first boat looked rough, these men looked like the walking dead. Led by Captain Heinz Schaefer, this crew had just achieved one of the craziest marine feats in human history. You see, the Atlantic was swarming with Allied planes and destroyers, and Schaefer knew that if his periscope broke the surface for even a minute during the day, they were dead. So, he ordered his men to stay submerged. Not for a day or a week, but for 66 days. Historically, naval psychologists believed a U-boat crew could only survive 40 days submerged before total psychological breakdown set in. U-977 did 66. Imagine that. 66 days locked in a vibrating steel tube, underwater, with no sun, no fresh air, and no escape. They breathed through a snorkel, a thin pipe that sucked in air while they ran the diesel engines. The boat was a sauna. The heat was unbearable. Mold grew on their clothes. The bread turned green and fuzzy. The stench of unwashed bodies and diesel fumes was so thick you could taste it. The crew begged Schaefer to surface as they just wanted to breathe, but Schaefer refused. He told them that surfacing meant capture, and capture meant death. When they finally stepped onto the Argentine dock, the Allies had one burning question. Why? Why go through 66 days of psychological torture just to surrender in South America? Captain Schaefer claimed he was just an innocent soldier saving his own skin. But the U.S. Navy didn't buy it. They looked at the timeline. They looked at the ghost convoy rumors. And they dragged Schaefer into a room, sat him under a hot lamp, and prepared to ask the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Where was Adolf Hitler? That was the question. But the Americans didn't just wait for an answer. While Schaefer and Wehrmacht were sweating under the lamps of the interrogation room, U.S. naval intelligence was ruthlessly tearing their submarines apart. They were obsessed, even X-rayed the bulkheads, but they found nothing. The captains claimed the boats were empty because they had to be. They swore they jettisoned all their torpedoes and heavy ammunition in the Atlantic so they could use the empty torpedo tubes as storage tanks for extra diesel fuel. Without that fuel, they argued, they never would have made the 6,000-mile journey. It sounds plausible, but the Allies saw it differently. They believed the torpedo tubes weren't emptied for diesel. They were emptied to make room for heavy crates. Crates that were quietly offloaded onto dinghies under the cover of darkness, miles before the subs officially docked. And here is the problem. We can't prove them wrong. Where are the logbooks and records? Well, Captain Wehrmacht tossed them overboard. He destroyed every chart, every radio code, and every cargo manifest moments before surfacing. Therefore, we will never know for sure what they offloaded before they docked. When pressed on why he ran, Captain Schaefer said, "I would rather live in Argentina than hang in Nuremberg." Simple logic. Or was it? We keep looking for a secret gold ship, like the SS Mark, to explain how the Nazis escaped. But the truth is much more disturbing. The SS Mark story claims a secret ship brought them to safety. The reality is scarier. They didn't need a secret ship. They used the Red Cross, the Ratlines, and the Sanctuary. While Allied intelligence was frantically scanning the Atlantic for fleets of rogue U-boats, the perpetrators of the Holocaust were standing in line, filling out paperwork. We call them the rat lines. But don't let the nickname fool you. This was a sophisticated, organized travel agency for war criminals. And the ticket out wasn't a submarine pass, it was a humanitarian passport. Picture this. You are Adolf Eichmann, officer of the SS, Holocaust organizer, convicted war criminal, and the most wanted man on Earth. How do you get to South America? You don't take a U-boat. Instead, you walk into a Red Cross office in Italy, claim you are a stateless refugee named Riccardo Clement, and they hand you a travel document. It is a chilling historical fact that the International Red Cross inadvertently issued travel papers to thousands of Nazis. They thought they were helping refugees fleeing communism. In reality, they were giving first-class tickets to monsters. But why did every rat line lead to Argentina? Because in 1945, Argentina wasn't just a destination, it was a sanctuary. At the time, President Juan Perón was in power, and while the rest of the world was building gallows, Perón was working on recruitment. He had a vision of a new Argentina, a nuclear superpower that could rival the United States. But he lacked the scientists to build it. So he looked at the crumbling remains of the Third Reich, and he didn't see war criminals. He saw talent. Perón explicitly ordered the creation of his own rat lines to import German scientists, engineers, and military strategists to modernize his army. It was a real-life South American version of Operation Paperclip. He sent agents to Europe with blank visas and bags of cash, essentially headhunting the SS. Men like Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, who performed horrific experiments on children at Auschwitz, didn't live in a cave or hide in a jungle. He lived in a wealthy Buenos Aires suburb. He drove a nice car. He even owned a pharmaceutical company and, for years, he operated under his own name. These men were thriving. They held reunions and sang old songs in German beer halls. They built a Fourth Reich, protected by a government that valued their technical skills more than human rights. But you can't build a new life on a soldier's pension. You need capital, lots of it. And this brings us back to the SS mark and the viral claim of 400 gold bars.
The race is on tonight to solve a mystery dating back to World War II and collect the riches that may come along with it. Legend has it that a Nazi train filled with gold was lost 7 decades ago.
The internet thinks the gold is at the bottom of the ocean, but it's not. The truth is far more cynical and will change everything you thought you knew about the fall of the Third Reich. Tainted gold. While treasure hunters dream of finding the SS mark full of bullion, the reality is that they never will, because the Nazis trusted lawyers with their fortune. It was called Operation Safe Haven. Long before the first Soviet tank rolled into Berlin, the Reich had already begun moving its assets via wire transfer. They used a sophisticated network of Swiss banks and shell companies in Spain and Argentina to launder the tainted gold into legitimate currency, putting the gold back into the banking system. By the time U-530 arrived in Mar del Plata, the money was arguably already there, waiting in numbered accounts, and it was this money that built the post-war economy of South America. The investment was so deep that it created a sense of normalcy for the escaped war criminals. Here is a shocking fact that usually gets left out of the history books. In the 1950s, the Mercedes-Benz factories in Argentina employed thousands of recent German immigrants. It was a thriving industrial hub, and some of the floor managers were former SS officers. They were punching clocks, managing assembly lines, and collecting paychecks, protected by the very corporate structures their stolen gold had helped build. But running a global money laundering operation is risky, so to keep the world's attention away from the bank accounts, the Nazis needed a distraction. They started a rumor so wild, so cinematic, that it blinded everyone to what was happening in Argentina. The Antarctica conspiracy. While the money was moving through banks, the world's eyes were fixed on the South Pole. This is where the SS mark viral lore borrows heavily from. The original conspiracy theory, Base 211. When U-977 arrived weeks late, looking like a ghost ship, the newspapers asked questions, but they were all about Antarctica. A rumor spread that Captain Schaefer had made a secret detour to the frozen continent to drop Adolf Hitler off at a secret subterranean base called New Swabia before surrendering in Argentina. But naval engineers have since calculated that a detour to Antarctica would have required thousands of extra gallons of diesel that U-977 physically could not carry. If they had turned south toward the ice, they would have drifted and died. However, the rumor served a perfect purpose, distracting the world from the real escapes happening in plain sight. Intelligence agencies spent millions of dollars and hours chasing leads about secret bases in the ice. But while they were looking through the ice, Adolf Eichmann and other high-ranking SS officials were relaxing in Buenos Aires. The survival of U-977 fueled the myth, but the boat itself was just a delivery vessel. And once the cargo was delivered, the U-boats themselves became a liability. They were giant, steel-smoking guns sitting in an Argentine harbor. You'd expect these boats, the literal vehicles of the greatest escape in history, to be preserved. You'd think they would be sitting in a museum in Buenos Aires, or perhaps in Washington. But the Allies were done messing around. In 1946, the U.S. Navy decided it didn't want these Nazi symbols to become shrines. So they hooked U-530 and U-977 to tugboats and hauled them thousands of miles north to the chilly waters off Massachusetts and used them for target practice. On a gray morning, the USS Atuli fired torpedoes into the empty, rusting hulls, blowing them apart and sinking them to the bottom of the ocean. They were erased, destroyed, gone. But while the steel skeletons were torn apart by torpedoes, the flesh and blood monsters who commanded them got a very different ending. And they didn't just live, they thrived. After the interrogations and the headlines about Hitler and Antarctica faded, the crews of U-530 and U-977 were quietly released. Most of them looked at the devastation of post-war Germany and looked at the sunny, welcoming avenues of Buenos Aires and chose to stay. They took off their Kriegsmarine uniforms and put on work shirts. They became mechanics, factory foremen, and businessmen. Captain Heinz Schaefer, the man who kept his crew in a tin can for 66 days, wrote a best-selling memoir and lived comfortably in Argentina for decades. Compared to the victims of the war, the millions who lost their futures, their families, and their lives in the camps, they got a second life. They married Argentine women. They had children who grew up speaking Spanish, oblivious to the fact that their fathers had once served the Third Reich. They grew old in peace, watching the sunsets over the very ocean they had once fought in. They stole years of life from millions, and in return, Argentina gave them 40 more years of sunshine. It creates a terrifying reality. We want our monsters to look like monsters. We want them to be hiding in dark caves, gnashing their teeth. But the reality of the ratlines reveals something far more disturbing. It is boring. It is quiet. And it is completely unsatisfying. We hate this ending. We hate the idea that the bad guys got away and died in their sleep. And that psychological need for a better ending, one where we catch them red-handed, is exactly why we are so obsessed with the 2023 discovery. It's about the fact that Nazi gold represents the only tangible piece of the Third Reich that we can still arguably punish. We can't put Hitler on trial. We can't storm the bunker again. The men who committed the crimes are dust, but the gold is the last surviving prisoner of war. Psychologically, we need to find it, because as long as the gold is missing, the war feels unfinished. It feels like they got away with the last loot of the robbery. Finding it would be a way to take back the evil, to melt it down and purify history. We aren't looking for treasure. We are chasing ghosts because we can't arrest them. But ask yourself this: if we pulled those 400 bars up from the mud tomorrow, would it actually fix anything? Would it bring anyone back? Or is the blood already on the money, deeply ingrained in the economy we live in today? The rat lines showed us how easily the rest of the world forgives genocide when it becomes politically convenient. We like to think the villain of this story is the U-boat captain refusing to surface, but the real villain might be the intelligence agencies of the West. When the Cold War started heating up, the United States and Britain didn't look at these escaped Nazis as enemies anymore. They looked at them as assets against the Soviet Union. Intelligence files declassified decades later reveal that Western spy agencies knew exactly where some of these men were, and instead of arresting them, they recruited them. The rat lines weren't just a leak in the system. They were a pipeline to something much bigger. The hatch of U-977 didn't just open for Germans to escape. It opened opportunities for them in the Cold War. We are looking for a sunken ship because it's a safe, contained story. The truth is a bit more complicated than that. The reality is that the enemy was integrated, not defeated. Here is a chilling thought to leave you with. In the 1950s and 60s, thousands of these men assimilated perfectly into society. They worked in factories in Ohio, engineering firms in Alabama, and auto plants in Buenos Aires. Your grandfather might have worked next to a man who escaped on a rat line, and he never knew. So, where does that leave us?
We're issuing today a preliminary study entitled U.S. and Allied Efforts to Recover and Restore Gold and Other Assets Stolen or Hidden by Germany During World War II.
We started this journey looking at a drone finding a $300 million ghost ship. We ended it looking at the rusting, torpedoed hull of U-977 and the possibility that Hitler may have lived out the rest of his days enjoying a bakery in Argentina. Over 80% of our oceans remain unexplored, so the ocean is very good at keeping secrets. There may well be wrecks down there that we haven't found, but history, if we look closely, tells us everything we need to know. The Nazis didn't need a ship to escape. They just needed a world that was ready to look the other way. But before we close the case file on this mystery, let's look at the timeline of what actually happened. Because when you stack the facts side by side, the picture becomes clear. We have been looking for a shipwreck when we should have been looking for a bank statement. Here is the truth of the Nazi escape. It starts with a ghost. In 2023, a drone descends into the Atlantic and finds the SS Mark, a ship that history says sank in the North Atlantic in 1945. It's the perfect story. A vessel erased from the records, carrying $300 million in tainted gold. We want to believe that the evil was contained in a steel box at the bottom of the ocean, just waiting for us to drag it into the light. But while the internet fights over a ship that might not be real, the true Nazi escape happened in broad daylight 80 years ago. It wasn't a secret ghost ship that brought the war to Argentina. It was the Grey Wolves. On July 10, 1945, months after the world celebrated peace, U-530 surfaced off the coast of Mar del Plata, and just as the world exhaled, the second wolf arrived. U-977, with its crew, submerged for 66 days before their arrival. Then there were the rat lines. We like to picture Nazis hiking through jungles, but the reality is they walked into Red Cross offices in Italy, picked up humanitarian passports under fake names, and boarded luxury liners. They didn't sneak into South America. They were invited by President Juan Perón, who wanted a nuclear superpower, and he headhunted the architects of the Third Reich to build it for him. So, what about the gold the drone supposedly found? The truth is, the Nazis trusted the Swiss banking system with their wealth, not the ocean. Through Operation Safe Haven, they laundered the looted wealth of Europe into shell companies in Spain and South America long before the war ended. The gold didn't sink. It was invested, and it built the factories, the skylines, and the pharmaceutical companies of post-war Argentina. And that leads us to the most uncomfortable realization of all. The reason these men, monsters like Josef Mengele and Adolf Eichmann, were able to live out their days in peaceful Argentine homes wasn't just because they were clever. It was because the Cold War had started and the world was willing to look the other way. Now, What do you think about the SS Mark? And be honest, would you keep the gold if you found it or turn it in? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to watch more videos like this, click this video right here.